This week on Steve and Friends, we have Stephen Hale, professor at Torrens University, along with Gabrielle Bond, CEO of the Modern Money Lab. Hope you enjoy the show. Stay tuned. I act as a host and a producer at the same time. I said a bunch of great things there in the first 30 seconds, and one of them was the date, which it's March 25th, 2023. We have two very special guests today, Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond. We had to do a recording for this. Unfortunately, because Stephen and Gabrielle were in Australia, Mr. Keane was in Europe, and I'm in Western Canada. So one of us had to stay up late. That was me. So at midnight, I recorded this with these fine people. But nonetheless, we did an hour-long show. Hello, WWE fan 01004. That would be Josh. How you doing, buddy? So we're going to play the recording in the first hour. We're going to keep the chat here on the side. Which side? This side right here. So make sure you're chatting. If you're on YouTube watching this, subscribe, hit the like button, do those important things. Also, underneath the video, make sure you comment, say how much you love the show, because that really helps with the algorithm. We want more and more people to come here and watch. And that has been happening. Just to let you know, I did make a graph for this week for our viewers, and not for our chatters, but for the viewership. So what I look for in the metrics of the show is how long a viewer stays and watches, not how many people come. That is what we call an exogenous variable in the system. I can't even pull a lever and control that. But within the system, the way we structure the show, the true metric, if we're doing well, if we have good guests, good contributors, is how long a person stays for. And that's been going up each episode. There is a clear trend. So that's really great. So I appreciate the people that stay are doing that. I made a few cool graphics. I'm going to try to put them on the side. I think you're going to find them amusing. After the pre-record, we're going to have Mike Radzicki on. He's our new guest contributor. He's going to be there every week. We'll have Daniel Sanderson from planks.org. And of course, Steve Keane will come along, sometime in the, process. You know how Steve is. One final note, the recording we did, as you know, Steve always has technical difficulties. He was having technical difficulties again. I managed to edit most of it out, but there is some feedback in about the 20-minute mark of the video, which I tried to reduce, and then it goes away in half the second 30 minutes. So it should be good. I don't want that to be a bad reflection on the guests, Gabrielle and Stephen Hale. And I might just add, Gabrielle, and I call her Gabby, what a beautiful individual. We need more women in economics. That is a must. And I want more women guests on this show because, quite frankly, I think they provide more insights into complex systems than men do. I'm going to put that out there. That's what I truly believe. So that's my goal. I want to make sure we have more women guests on this show. because I think we are missing 50% of the world when we are not involving very, very smart people in the process. So, without further ado, I'm going to throw it on up there, and I'll see you in about an hour. I'll be inside the chat. I know Mike will be in the chat. Daniel will be in the chat. Hopefully, Steve shows up and he'll be in the chat. So, yeah, we will see you in an hour. Here it is. All right, so we've got Stephen Hale, Steve Keen, and Gabrielle Bond, which I'm going to call her Gabby through the entirety of this recording. This is the first time we've done a recording for the show. So if you're watching this now, we've done this a few days ago, but make sure you keep chatting on the side. We're not there, but we are there. I'll start it off here. I'll ask the question to Steve Keen. How are you aware of Stephen Hale? And I've got to get my Steve. So, and also Steve, you're Steve, and Stephen Hale, you're Stephen. That's
okay,
how we're.
That should work. Yep. Yeah. Or just basically through, I think through Twitter and through the internet and through both being Aussies or all being Aussies as it happens. And so did we actually correspond before that, Steve? Before we were chatting on Twitter? Stephen?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, I'm familiar with Steve's work for many years, but we haven't really been in contact until relatively recently, and it was via Twitter.
Yeah. So that's it. And then, I mean, I have to say on top of that, the fact we have a shared Australian cultural background. There are lots of lousy things about Australia, but one of the nice things is a sense of mateship, which is non-sexist. It's something which applies to male and female, and there's an instant sense of camaraderie, which I have to say is better than can happen in some other cultures. I won't mention which ones, but yeah,
well,
we tend to be more cooperative over here most of the time. So this is three people that I very much like and very happy to work with, and there's tolerance of deviation from a core paradigm, which I think is sometimes hard to achieve in different cultures.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have to admit, I'm a Londoner. I've been here 25 years now, but I spent more than half my life in London. That's where I come from originally.
Okay,
you're honorary, definitely.
Okay, so my next question, maybe you can't answer this because now I'm finding out your nationality is not originally Australian. I was going to ask you because my relationship with Australians basically hinges on my relationship with Steve. So I was going to ask, is Steve a normal Australian or is he a little bit different?
Gabby, would you like to answer that? You haven't said anything yet.
Yes, Gabby, you answer that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think no, I think well, Stephen Hale and I were talking about this morning about people where they still call home, even if they've lived in Australia for more than 40 years. They might still think of themselves as British or belonging to a different country, and then in contrast, other people are, even though they might not sound Australian, they have, they call Australia home and they've never looked back, sort of thing. So I'm not sure where Professor Keen would fit in this paradigm. I think Australians have like a bit of a thing about joyful sledging between, paying each other out. We love that. I think you'd probably do that pretty well.
I do. Yeah.
And we also have a bit of like the tall poppy syndrome, which I don't know. I don't particularly like that trait about Australians. I think we tend to sort of downplay how great we are sometimes, and not always to our benefit.
Those are several very good points there about Australian culture. I mean, for example, the capacity to send each other up. I don't know what you called it when you were at school, Gabby, but we called it shayaking. I have absolutely no idea why it was called shayaking, but it was called shayaking. And you'd be sitting down with a bunch of friends at the railway station waiting to get the train back home from school and that sort of thing. And your objective would be make somebody blush. Okay.
Yeah.
You try to find something, you try to hit him with something. Oh, that got you. And, some sort of joke that ended up making you feel embarrassed. That was shayaking. So you're forever ribbing somebody. And that means you don't exalt and take them seriously. Whereas in America, one of the cultural things is you've got to walk out saying, I'm going to lead the country across, I'm going to be the person who takes us from one side of the continent following manifest destiny.
Yep.
And there's a level of arrogance to the American culture coming out of that attitude. And there's a level of sarcasm and satire coming out of the Australians. So that makes Australian humour rather more ironic.
Yeah.
And actually, you can actually go up and call it ionic, because if you know your Greek and Greek history, the main battlers, the fighters of the Battle of Thermopylae weren't the Spartans; they were the Ionics. And there's a wonderful expression. I know this is true. You'll actually find it in that crazy movie, The 300. You know that one, that incredibly cartoonish movie about the Battle of Thermopylae. At one stage, somebody says, there are so many Persian archers, I'm told that their arrows blot out the sun. And one of the Ionic warriors says, great, that means we can fight in the shade. And one more historical anecdote. This is my personal history. There are parts of Australian culture we do and don't like, as you said. And I got the beautiful way to differentiate between the two, given to me by none other than Sir Peter Ustinov. You guys are old enough to remember Peter Ustinov?
I remember.
Or young
Peter
enough
Ustinov.
to. Yeah, he was a brilliant humorist and mimic. And Academy Award winner, and just an incredible human being, born Russian and grew up in England, just a superb human being. I met him. I won't go into the circumstances here necessarily, but he had an appalling taxi ride. And it turned out the reason was the taxi driver was incredibly racist, and then turned back to see that Ustinov was not sharing his racism at all and was in fact horrified. And the Australian drawled at him, and Ustinov, this is the second time ever in the country he played the perfect Australian accent. I suppose you don't give a fuck what I think. I suppose you reckon all us Australians are descended from fucking convicts. And Ustinov, in beautiful elocution, says, on the contrary, my dear man, I'm convinced you're descended from one of the warders. So there's water and convict. I've used that ever since. Water and convict streams to Australian culture. And the place works well when the convicts are in charge, and it's shithouse when the warders are in charge.
Very true. We have a bit of a thing about like Americans needing to be, completely firm in their self-belief. And I remember we had this crazy show called Review with Miles Barlow. And he once did a segment where he reviewed self-help programs, and he decided that he was going to swim to New Zealand. And so we say, you can swim to New Zealand. You've just got to believe in yourself. Which he was rescued pretty quickly and brought back to shore in a very bedraggled state.
Yeah, in defense,
it's only 2,000 miles, isn't it? Nothing really. For a motivated American, 2,000 miles is nothing. It's simply there's either one continent or the other. The fact that there's no land there is, we'll find a solution to that.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll bomb it. Sorry. Apologies to Americans.
I was going to say, when I first moved to Australia, I found some cultural differences that surprised me. I don't know whether this is that Adelaide's a small town, it's not Sydney or Melbourne, or whether it's the UK and Australia, but I found Australians disconcertingly nice in some ways, but that misled me. When I was looking for work, when I first got over here, if I went to see, when I had to chat with someone, I know, Flinders University or somewhere, and I'd say, do you need any chance of any work here? They'd never say no.
Oh,
they'd say maybe. Whereas I'm a Londoner, so in London, if there isn't anything, someone will just say, no, there isn't anything. Here, it's, oh, yeah, sure.
Nothing follows
nice to you. but it took me a couple of years to get used to the fact that, yeah, sure, normally meant no.
Have you heard? I remember seeing some linguist giving a lesson in America and saying that there are double negatives. You know no double negatives that mean a positive. You know, so there's no double positives that mean a negative. And one of the students said, "Yeah, right." So Australians don't want to disappoint you, but they therefore don't give you full information either.
Well,
Unintentional, but that's one of the side effects.
It's great when you get used to it. Took me a while to get used to it.
Yeah.
So we'll steer this. I want the viewers to know, in case they don't know, even though a lot of our viewers are MMTers. Stephen Hale, what is MMT?
Oh my goodness, that's where we're going to start. MMT. Okay. What is MMT? MMT is an approach to thinking about macroeconomics and the role of the government within the economy, which takes the monetary system seriously. And Ty has disappeared. Are you still there, Ty? Oh, you are still there.
You're silent, Ty.
Except I can't hear you.
Yeah. You're the silent Canadian.
So I thought you were going to have a very long explanation on what MMT was. So I was just going to sit back in the background because it is midnight here.
Yeah.
So you can snore in the meantime while you give your answer. Yeah. He goes into the back. He's got a control panel, so he can decide who shows on which screen and who appears and who doesn't.
Stephen, I want your best explanation of MMT. We've got the time, right? There's, if we got to go a little longer than 50 minutes, that's fine. So
no pressure.
No pressure.
Okay. MMT, or modern monetary theory, is an approach to macroeconomics, and particularly the role of the federal government within the economy, which takes the way the monetary system works seriously. It takes the plumbing of the monetary system seriously. If I'm asked to talk about modern monetary theory very briefly, I usually start by talking about the difference between a currency issuer and currency users, which is something which is strangely neglected in mainstream economics. You and I, and Gabby, and businesses, and not-for-profits, and state governments, and even some national governments that don't issue their own currency, have to find dollars before they can spend them. So if I want to spend dollars, I have to earn them, or I have to have saved them in the past, in which case I can draw down my savings, or I have to borrow dollars now, in which case I have to repay the dollars in the future. And there's a chance that if I take on too much debt now, I may get into financial distress. In the future, I might even go bust. That is not the case for our federal government, because our federal government is a currency issuer. If you're a currency issuer, you spend new currency into existence every time you engage in an act of spending. So the federal government in Australia, every single dollar that the government spends every day, and the government might spend up to $2 billion a day, is a new dollar. Every single dollar that our federal government spends increases the monetary base, and every measure of the money supply in Australia by $1 adds to the net financial assets of the private sector by $1. When the government taxes, the government simply deletes dollars from the system which it's previously spent into the system. If the government runs a deficit, then that means the government is spending more dollars into the system than it is deleting from the system, adding to the net financial assets of the private sector, adding to private sector financial wealth. Our government is what we describe as a full monetary sovereign, which means that our government in Australia has more power more freedom of action as far as fiscal policy is concerned than most other currency issuers have around the world. And that's because our government doesn't just collect taxes in Australian dollars, but the Australian dollar is on a floating exchange rate. It's not fixed or convertible into any commodity or any foreign currency or anything that the government could possibly run out of. And the Australian government has no significant foreign currency denominated debt either. It hasn't had any significant foreign currency denominated debt for about 20 years now. That means that as far as insolvency is concerned, that's not an issue for the Australian Commonwealth Government. While we retain our current monetary system, it is literally impossible for the Australian government to run out of domestic currency, being the currency issuer, and it can't run out of anything else as far as financial assets are concerned too, because it has no financial liabilities that are not denominated in its own currency. Our government, like any government, faces real and financial constraints on its spending. Spending by the Australian government and by anybody, the private sector or the rest of the world, on goods and services produced in the Australian economy is constrained by the productive capacity of the Australian economy. So it's constrained by the supply of labour and capital and natural resources and skills and technology and the institutional capacity that we have within the Australian economy. So if there's too much spending in the economy, then of course it can drive prices up. It can be inflationary, but there's no purely financial constraints as far as the Australian government is concerned. And there's something else that I should add too, which I've sort of implied already, but I haven't explained explicitly. And that is that the deficits and surpluses in our monetary system, as is the case on any monetary system, must cancel out. For every deficit, there is a surplus. So when the Australian Commonwealth Government deficit spends, as it does most of the time, as it has done for almost all the time since federation, that creates a surplus somewhere else in our monetary system. Of course, it matters a great deal where those dollars are going. It matters a great deal who is the recipient of that surplus, whether it's people on low incomes or whether it's billionaires, or for that matter, whether it's the rest of the world. But nonetheless, our surpluses and our deficits, surpluses and deficits on the monetary system cancel out every year over time. I'm run dry now. I'm very tired.
Well, the basic point being that we're talking about financial assets.
Yeah.
And a financial asset is a claim on somebody else. So if you get involved in a transaction, there's an asset and a liability to you, and a liability and an asset to the other party. Add them up, the sum is zero.
Right.
And that's actually become a major insight I've got out of building my Minsky software. So I came to MMT in the sense of coming to it through building a software package designed initially so that I could model the credit system properly, which is private money creation. But of course, you can equally apply that to government creation, because my background is Hyman Minsky. Then I spent most of my time talking about the dangers of private debt. But what comes out of the MMT is the non-dangers of government debt. Because what government debt amounts to is the record of government money creation, because what's actually going on with the government money creation is that the liability it's creating is for itself. And this is what Minsky shows analytically, is that if the government, the Treasury ultimately is spending by creating negative equity for itself, but that negative equity is dollar for dollar matched by the positive equity it creates for the non-government sector. Pardon me.
Absolutely.
The non-government equity we call the money supply, or at least the fiat section of the money supply. So all these Austrian types, and I get sick and tired of Austrians trying to lecture me about the monetary system, which they don't understand. They think it'd be great if the government saved money just like the rest of us. But the thing is, you can't save liabilities. In this sense, if you try to have less liabilities, you've got less money in terms of government money. So their vision of a perfect society in which the government runs a balanced budget, or even preferably does not exist, ends up being a private money system in which the private sector has no net equity, because every asset it has is matched by a liability to somebody else. And therefore the private sector the overall private sector net financial assets is zero, and the non-bank section of the economy, in the absence of a government sector, the non-bank sector has negative equity, because banks, as we're finding out this couple of weeks with that lovely one called Silicon Valley Bank, banks must have positive equity or they're bankrupt. So if you divide the non-government economy into bank and non-bank, you find that in the absence of government, the non-bank private sector must be in negative equity. Now, they can still operate in negative equity because the definition of bankruptcy for a non-bank is to not be able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. If you're a bank, you must have, your definition is you must have positive equity. So your assets must exceed your liabilities. For the private non-bank sector, the definition fundamentally is you must be able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. So if you're making a cash flow out of the money you've borrowed from the banking sector and you're paying wages, et cetera, then you can continue operating even though your net financial assets are negative. But when you have a government in the system and the government runs a deficit, that means, I better finish that line of thought. That to me is a major factor behind why we have asset bubbles. Because if you find yourself with negative financial assets, then your attitude, oh, I better go and buy a non-financial asset. And that's things like a house or shares above par value. Because in that situation, they are something which is an asset to the owner, but a liability to no one. Okay. So if you buy a house, you might have a mortgage on the house, but the house itself is your asset. There's nobody for whom your house is a liability. Okay. So we buy these damn things. We buy them with borrowed money. And there's a link between the price we think those things, the non-financial assets, can sell for and the amount of money we've borrowed. We got caught up in an asset bubble with I've got to go to my camera, a rising level of private debt happening, and then we have a crash. So getting rid of the government leads to financial crises, and that's not exactly what Austrians think.
Yeah, if I can sort of feed back into that by pointing out that it's normal for governments to run deficits. Yeah. The International Monetary Fund publishes data on government deficits and surpluses, well, for many countries, but also it publishes data on the average of the 39 highest income economies in the world, one of which is Australia. And if you go back all the way to 1990, and I'm sure this would be true prior to 1990 as well, they just don't publish the data before 1990, every single year on average, even just before the financial crisis, governments run deficits. And the reason why governments run deficits is it's normal for the private sector to run surpluses. The private sector desires to run surpluses over time. Those surpluses have to come from somewhere. If the private sector is going to net save in Australian dollars, those Australian dollars have got to come from somewhere else. And the only place they can come from is the government sector, which generally speaking means the federal government running deficits year in, year out. Australia is very unusual. What's unusual about Australia is that for 8 out of 10 years from 1996, the Australian Commonwealth government ran fiscal surpluses. What made these fiscal surpluses possible was not Australia having a trade surplus at the time. Australia had a trade deficit. What made these fiscal surpluses possible was the private sector was running large deficits. Now, those deficits were not being driven by corporate borrowing at the time. They weren't being driven largely by mining companies borrowing in order to dig big holes in the ground. They were being driven by increasing household debt. And that increasing household debt did a couple of things. It took Australia from, in the early 1990s, being amongst high-income countries, a country with a very low level of household debt to GDP. By 2010 or so, Australia had the second or highest ratio of household debt to GDP in the world. And we're still up there as one of the countries that have the highest household debt to GDP ratios. And at the same time, what this did was it helped to drive up property prices so that we now have amongst the most expensive property in the world related to people's incomes. So the government surpluses in Australia under the Howard government were surpluses that were built on the back of household borrowing, and household borrowing that drove the property market up and created a much more fragile financial system in Australia than we otherwise would have had. We got the balance of fiscal and monetary policy wrong. We deregulated our financial system, and we then encouraged lenders and borrowers to drive a property bubble which Steve has been talking about for many years, which hasn't corrected yet, basically because successive governments in Australia will do almost anything to stop that bubble from collapsing, although there's pressure on it at the moment. And what we should have had during the Howard years was less austerity. We should have had deficit spending by the government. We should not have been encouraging financial deregulation, the extension of more and more credit in the housing sector. We shouldn't have been driving house prices up the way we did. We should have managed our economy differently. We would have had stronger household balance sheets before the pandemic. On average, we've got stronger household balance sheets post-pandemic than we did before, but that was because of the deficit spending by the government during the pandemic that allowed households on average to net save. Unfortunately, the distribution of that net saving is not ideal. It's driven an increase in, it's helped to drive an increase in both wealth and income inequality in Australia. But we got all these things wrong for the same reason that the design of the Eurozone went wrong, for the same reason that Bill Clinton thought it was great to be running fiscal surpluses in the US in the late 1990s as the US financial system was deregulated, for the same reason that the property boom and the spread and the rapid growth and importance of mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps and the increasing fragility in the US financial system was tolerated and even encouraged prior to 2008, for the same reason that there was insufficient fiscal support when the financial crisis struck in the US in 2008 and subsequently, for the same reason that they thought quantitative easing would be the best way of bringing about economic recovery subsequent to the GFC, which it wasn't. It achieved virtually nothing in terms of supporting demand and pushing the economy back to full employment. For the same reason, they're still mismanaging the monetary system now, which is one of the factors driving the mini banking crisis, and who knows what the consequences of that will be in the weeks and months to come that we're observing at the moment, which is that our policymakers, their advisors, academic economists, and generations of people that these academic economists have educated don't understand the way the monetary system works and don't understand modern monetary theory. First of all, the Get Up campaign. And that in my view, that shows the absurdity of Australian economics as far as Australian academia is concerned, because Get Up were looking for some advisors for their Future to Fight For campaign, which included a large chunk of modern monetary theory. And their advisors were Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, Stephanie Kelton, and they were looking for an Australian. And there was Steve was not in Australia at the time. There were so few people that you could ask to do this in Australia. I mean, the obvious one is Bill Mitchell, but he didn't want to be involved with Get Up at the time. Basically, I think they ran out of people, and they ended up with me. So we had the ridiculous situation that the three advisors were Joseph Stiglitz, Stephanie Kelton, and me. So that's how come I met Gabby. But as far as the conference is concerned, that is linked to a great friend of ours who sadly has passed on now, called Geoffrey Harcourt, who is one of the icons of post-Keynesian economics. And in my view, up in the top 2 or 3 Australian economists in the history of the discipline in this country, and a wonderful man, a former head of school in the School of Economics at the University of Adelaide, where I used to work. In about 2018, when Geoffrey was asked, as he was each year, about who the university ought to invite to do a big set piece lecture called the Harcourt Lecture the following year. Jeff said, look, I'm getting old, I'm not going to live much longer. Could I please have somebody next year that I'd like to listen to? Because we've had Joseph Stiglitz, we've had Paul Krugman, we've had people like that. And although Jeff was friends with many of those people, they didn't really share many of Jeff's views as far as economics was concerned. And the university said to Jeff, sure, who would you like to invite? And Jeff gave the university and the School of Economics, Adelaide Uni, is quite conservative, a list of Marxists. And so the head of school at the time came to see me. I was working in the School of Economics at Adelaide Uni and said, can you recommend anyone who isn't a Marxist who Jeff would be happy to listen to? And I just saw a chance to get the University of Adelaide to pay to bring Stephanie Kelton to Australia. Beyond that, I saw a chance with Gabby's help to strike a blow for something that a great friend of ours and colleague called Phil Lorne and I have been trying to do for more than a decade, which is to draw modern monetary theory and ecological economics together. That's what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to get the MMT people to talk to the ecological economists. And Phil particularly has been going to ecological economics conferences for years and saying, you guys don't really understand the monetary system, and it would help a lot if you did. And he's been trying to draw them in the other direction. So we took advantage of Stephanie coming to give the Harcourt lecture. And in the end, she came in January 2020. So we got loads of media attention because she was Bernie Sanders' economics advisor. And at the time, it looked as though Bernie might win the Democratic nomination. When she was over here, she was interviewed by every newspaper. She did radio interviews. She was on TV as well. But since she was coming, we thought we'd organize a conference. And so we invited various MMT people, including Professor Mitchell, but Martin Watts and other people from the MMT school in Australia as well. And we invited some leading ecological economists too, including Bob Costanza, who was at ANU at the time, and Phil, of course, and another great friend of ours called Mark Diesendorf, who's an expert on renewable energy in particular, amongst other things. But as Gabby was saying, we invited other people too. We didn't just get any old trade unionists. We had Tony Mayer, the leader of the Miners' Union, come to the conference because we thought we're going to put all these people in the same room and we're going to force them to talk to each other. And it was an amazing event. We had 450 members of the public come to this conference, and hardly any of them left before the end of 3 days. It was the most amazing experience that I've had in my life. Gabby was more or less press ganged into starting up a press group.
Really, that it was that
in Adelaide. Afterwards, we had the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group and a gentleman called Con Michalakis, who I think Steve might know, who was at the time the chief investment officer of an institution called Statewide Super, South Australia's largest superannuation fund. He's now a deputy chief investment officer of a larger merged super fund. Came up to me afterwards and said, you have got to start running courses in MMT and ecological economics at the University of Adelaide. And what's more, I'm a big donor to the University of Adelaide. Get on and do it. So I tried. I spoke to some people at the University of Adelaide, and I don't know if Steve knows any of the guys there. I love them very much, but they are very, very, very neoclassical. And the days of post-Keynesian economics at the University of Adelaide are in the past, I'm afraid. And I basically got laughed at. So we started to talk to other public unis. And this won't surprise Steve either, but there really wasn't much interest amongst public unis in Australia. I happen to have some connections at one of Australia's 2 private universities, which is Torrens University. And we discovered that the person who is our head of faculty now at Torrens University is a big fan of Steve Keen's work, which meant he was very well informed and was open to talking to us. And we went to see the Vice Chancellor of the academic head of Torrens University, and he was reading Kate Raworth's Donut Economics when we went to see him, which is also a very good sign as far as I was concerned. And they've been very encouraging. We have structured what we are doing to take into account the fact that we want to expose these very encouraging people to the risk of financial loss. So we have set up a charity, Modern Money Lab, and this charity in the future, I hope, will be able to fund research by young academics. We have some young ecological economists and MMT economists in mind. We don't yet have the funding to allow us to do that. We also hope, given that we're running these courses, that we'll be able to extend over time more and more scholarships, particularly to students from Global South countries, because we've had a lot of inquiries. But again, we don't have the funding yet to do that. But with Con's help, we have put together the funding to develop a graduate certificate, a graduate diploma, and a master's degree. The graduate certificate and graduate diploma are nested within the master's degree, which we are offering online, and we're rolling out the subjects one after another across the next couple of years. The charity is funding the development of these subjects, not the university, but the university has given us, I must say, a good deal so that we own the intellectual property as far as these subjects are concerned that we're developing, and a significant share of the fee income comes back to the charity, which means once we've covered those setup costs, we can start doing those other things. Now, what's been most encouraging really is 2 things. We're in our 2nd trimester now. What's been encouraging is the level of interest that we've had from people all over the world. We've got students in Auckland, we've got students in Los Angeles, and lots of places in between who are interacting with each other, because we run live classes twice a week in each subject, so it covers all the time zones. Particularly, we've got at least one federal government advisor on our program. We've got university professors, we've got climate scientists, we've got activists like Gabby, we've got new graduates who are looking to learn about the economics of the 21st century and understand that what they've been taught, those of them that have an economics background already on their undergraduate degree, is in important respects misleading and certainly inadequate to meet the challenges that we have ahead. That's been most encouraging. Then beyond that, what's been encouraging is the people that have offered to develop subjects and teach for us. So we have teaching macroeconomics for us at the moment. Actually, he was teaching today. We have Scott Fulweiler. There is no MMT economist. There's nobody in that school who is a better macroeconomist.
So I want to get Steve Keen's opinion on the combination, what Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond are doing with MMT and ecological economics. I'll mute you, Steve. What do you think?
Yeah. Firstly, I apologise for the noise. Somebody's drilling. I'm in a concrete apartment block here, and somebody's drilling. So I hope the sound isn't too bad with the drill noise coming through. Yeah, it's absolutely vital, because like that's become by coincidence, that combination has become part of my academic portfolio as well. So I heard nonlinear dynamics and chaos theory, Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, now modern monetary theory in the context of my Minsky software, but also ecological economics. And the reason that happened is I read the neoclassicals. And everybody knows I've been a critic of neoclassical economics for over half a century now. The stuff published by idiots like Nordhaus and Richard Toll and Mendelssohn and a whole range of, including some nice people I know, is the worst shit I've read in the entire 50 years I've been reading economics. And what's going on here, I think, is that I call it the neoclassical disease, because the neoclassical theory, they try to describe themselves as hard-nosed and logical, blah, blah, blah. That's where they come and say that's why, we've got hair in our chest, that's why we want to have austerity. And most of them do have hair in their chest, because the vast majority are male, not female, even more so than other academic disciplines. And they just basically assumed climate change couldn't be a problem because capitalism is the world's most flexible financial system. So let's make a simplifying assumption that the climate is weather, and therefore you have a roof over your head, you can't be affected by climate change. And I wish I was joking, but that is fundamentally the starting point of William Nordhaus's arguments in 1991 in a paper called To Slow or Not to Slow, published by the Economic Journal, which is one of the top 5 journals in the profession. So I realized I had to raise the alarm about how bad this stuff is. And the trouble is, most people, and I was in the same boat, a lot of heterodox economists and I were in the same boat, thought that what they were doing was taking the research of scientists, which we give the empirical data, and then applying economic concepts, including discounting to it, and therefore coming up with small numbers for current damage from climate change. In fact, they're making up their own bloody numbers, which had no relation whatsoever to climate change, and then using those numbers to imply that climate change wasn't dangerous. And governments and politicians and journalists have taken them seriously, and that's why we're on the brink of an ecological collapse. So
I picked that up from you, Steve. I picked up particularly from you. I thought that the issue was going to be that they were using too high a discount rate. When looking at the future costs of climate change, discounting them too heavily. But no, it's not that at all, is it?
It's the numbers. Okay, they're discounting trivial numbers. That's the real problem. Nordhaus actually explains it the thing is, this is all in open space, and what stuns the shit out of me, as usual, is why the hell am I the first person to expose this crap? Because they have been criticized quite extensively by lots of neoclassical economists themselves for stupid things they've done. So, for example, they use a quadratic with y equals x squared to try to predict the future damage from climate change. And y equals x squared, everybody knows the shape of that diagram. The only question is how steep or flat is your parabola? Well, they give a coefficient for it of this is Nordhaus, 0.227% is their coefficient. So they say for each degree of temperature increase, GDP will fall by that to 0.227% multiplied by the temperature change squared. So you need a 4-degree increase in temperature to get a 1% fall in GDP. And that's 1% in the distant future compared to what it is now. That's the numbers they start with. Then they discount those numbers. Now, what Nordhaus said was the role of the discount is not to discount rate is there so that the relatively small damages in the next 2 or 3 centuries are not overwhelmed by major damages in the subsequent millennia. And that's literally his quote. So he thinks the next 2 or 3 centuries is going to cause relatively small damages. If we keep on the current rate, there won't be a human civilization by the end of this century.
And it's not an exaggeration to say that he might lead us to our doom.
Sorry?
It's not an exaggeration to say that this kind of thinking is what will tip us over the edge and we can't come back from it. That's not what I think or what I hope will happen. I think we have the tools and resources to pull ourselves back from that. But economics, in a neoclassical sense, has done so much damage to our willingness and our tools to be able to fix this crisis. And if you're listening to this and you've never heard about this stuff before and you're appalled by what you're hearing, you should be appalled. And please go check it out. And afterwards, get some counseling if you need it. I'm serious. It's very serious stuff.
So, Gabby, tell me more about your thoughts on combining, modern monetary theory with ecological economics. Is that an important issue for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. Ecological economics has got to be the starting point, right? Because what do we say? The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. You know, you can't just pretend that the environment is over there and we'll just like put that in a little box over there and we'll keep producing waste and nothing bad's going to happen, and we can keep growing and multiplying and producing heat and to taking away our ecological systems that sustain us. You just can't keep doing that, right? So you've got to start with the laws of thermodynamics and live within a closed system. The Earth is a closed system. So that's the first starting point. And then from there, well, the modern monetary theory part of it is really a very powerful tool in the toolbox of what we might do to put ourselves on a path to the kind of inner ring of the donut, as Kate Raworth would describe it, you know, where you're not overstepping your planetary boundaries, but also you have the resources to lift people out of the extreme poverty where they don't have where they're not able to have a good life. They don't have, you know, the education or the healthcare or the cultural belonging that people need. Everybody needs to have a good and sustainable and a prosperous life, right? So thinking about that inner ring of the donut, modern monetary theory is a very powerful tool of central currency issuing governments that can use their power to actually make that happen. Because if we don't have that tool, then we're asking the private sector to do it. And I don't know that is going to be an effective way forward.
Right. So I think we're actually almost an hour into this now. So I got to get into the serious questions that I have. And my first question, are kangaroos as dangerous as they appear to be in all the YouTube videos I have seen? I want an Australian's opinion, because now I've seen I have obsessions with YouTube videos. Usually they're train crashes. I love watching train crashes for some reason on Twitter and in real life on YouTube. But I saw this guy, the kangaroo was holding his dog, and this Australian guy goes over there and gives him the 1-2, and I think the kangaroo gave a punch back. Are they really as dangerous as they appear to be, or is that just overblown? Oh, Steve might want to comment.
Okay, I'll give you a couple of anecdotes here, and they're genuine. Okay, at school, I had a brilliant Catholic priest who ran the local school in Hurstville, Father Dunley. He was an Irishman. He started Alcoholics Anonymous because he was an alcoholic himself, obviously, and a wonderful human being, great personality. And of all things, he had a enclosure in his presbytery, including a range of Australian animals, including a kangaroo. And there was one kid in my class, Bobby Vines. I since became ended up, he was one of the toughies in the class. I'm 6 years old here, by the way. But Bobby would bash people up and stuff like that. And nothing could stop Bobby. So the cricket ball got hit over the fence and landed in the cow compound. And Bobby climbed the fence to go and get it. And the kangaroo came towards him. And Bobby shaped up. And the kangaroo goes boom and knocked Bobby out. They literally do punch. Another time on one of a country property that my family had links to, there was a giant red. This was a giant red stand at 2 meters tall. They're small compared to the megafauna that were here before humans turned up, by the way, which were 4 meters tall kangaroos. But that was chased by 6 dogs, and it then ran into a pond on the water reservoir on the property, and waited for the dogs to swim out to it and drowned each of them. So they are very intelligent animals. I don't know how intelligent, but they can read a movie script. We have the old movie here called Skippy. They are they're perfectly adapted for the humid Australian climate. So the females are almost always pregnant, and they have a baby. They have a baby. They're pregnant. They've got a baby in the pouch, and they've got one outside. But if conditions turn tough, they reabsorb the one they're giving birth to. So their population is controlled by the climate. Now that's rather different to us. We have destroyed the climate by our population growth and by our incredible inequality and so on. So I have a lot of time for kangaroos, and I reckon when we wipe ourselves out, and there's quite a good chance we'll do that now, the most likely species to take over, because they could potentially develop opposable thumbs because they get around on hind legs just like we do, are kangaroos.
Okay.
So you're muted, mate.
I didn't mute you. Okay, so we'll steer this back because we're running out of time. I want 2 minutes from Gabby. I want you to give out your message about Torrens University, Modern Money Lab. What's your message? I'm going to put whatever links you put out there. I'm going to put that in the description underneath the video. So 2 minutes or less, tell me.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so Modern Money Lab is a charity in Australia that has a partnership with Torrens University. And Modern Money Lab is my employer, I suppose. I'm the CEO and sole employee at the moment, but hopefully that will change in the future. Thank you very much for sharing the link. It's www.modernmoneylab.org.au. And if you go to that website, you'll be able to find from there our page, which is about our postgraduate program of the economics of sustainability. So combining the ecological economics and the modern monetary theory. And we have a whole bunch of other really fantastic subjects within the master's degree as well. So we have a subject about inequality. We have microeconomics, macroeconomics. We have a subject that's just for the masters, which is about professional economic writing. So which is a great subject to do if you want to consider going on to doing a doctorate. We have brilliant teachers. We have John T. Harvey coming on board, the cowboy economist that people might have heard of. We have Eric Dean. We have a brilliant young ecological economist called Colleen Schneider joining our teaching team as well. You can find all of those people on our website. So yeah, I'm really, really excited and thrilled to be able to take part in this venture with Stephen and Phil and all of our good friends who are teaching with us. It's a great privilege to be able to do it and to spend my working life really making a difference. I love talking to students. I love going on the tutorials and being part of that. And I love talking to new students and potential people who might be coming on board about what we're offering. It really is a great program. If you want to be an economist and change the world for the better, this is the course that you need to do. And we would be delighted to have you as a student and joining with us. And even if you just want to, have a look at our website and see what we're up to, from June this year, we're hopefully we will be rolling out the first subject in our master's degree, which is Foundations of Real World Economics, which is kind of like an overview. And you get a little bit of everything in that topic. And we will be able to offer that as a standalone subject, which you can do for 12 weeks. And best of all, you can do that and you don't have to do the assessments. You can just do it for fun and join the tutorials.
You don't get the qualification then. You just get to join in the discussion.
That's
okay. Right. Okay, Stephen Hale, 2 minutes or less. Tell me.
This is what I want to leave behind me. I have spent 35 years training bankers originally and teaching financial economics, neoclassical first of all, but for the last 10 to 15 years, MMT inspired. I have been the token heterodox economist in a G8 university for a while, and then I got sick of it. So what I have done is I have written a master's degree, at least as far as the syllabus is concerned. And I've then got a bunch of great people to write subjects and teach on it. What I want is for us to become irrelevant. We will become irrelevant when the University of Adelaide, ANU, Harvard, the LSE, everywhere is running a degree or a set of degrees similar to what we're now offering. We want them to copy us and to compete us out of business. If we're going to change the world, we've got great economists like Steve, we've got more humble economists like me, but we're in our 60s, we're going into the 70s. We're not going to be here forever. We have got to replace ourselves. We've got to find another Warren Mosler. We've got to find another Herman Daly. We've got to find another Steve King. We've got to find another Stephanie Kelton. We need more and more people coming through who are going to work in policy institutions and elsewhere, and academia as well, and build a future equitable, more equitable, sustainable economy, and build an economics discipline that has many elements within it that Professor Steve Keen and others have been campaigning for years. That's what we're trying to do.
That's great. You know what, guys? Gabby, Stephen, I'm really glad you guys took some time out of your day to do this. I just want to be, I was talking to Gabby before you came on, Stephen, and I've been watching like your tweets. And this is an area of MMT that really interests me, is the academic area. There's so much, there's a community of MMTers out there, and some of them don't quite translate the messaging themselves properly. So when I see individuals like yourself and Gabby, I find that very important, because I'm a believer in MMT. I'm a Win Godly type MMTer, you could say, but I got my foot in the door. So it's very important that what's being taught out there is done formally. And I think it's great what you're doing.
For me, MMT is only a small part. I mean, I know I'm seen as an MMT economist, if I'm seen as anything, but MMT is an instruction manual, as Stephanie Kelton often says, which is really important for policymakers and for informed citizens generally to understand. But the ecological economics, especially these days, is equally important to me, because it's giving us a higher goal or a set of higher goals, which we need to be trying to move towards. MMT on its own, an understanding of the monetary system can be used for good or for ill, and it's very important that our students have an understanding of the work, not only of Warren Mosler and Randall Wray and Stephanie Kelton and Bill Mitchell and the MMT community, and of course Steve King's work, which is related to it as well, but also Herman Daly and Kate Raworth, and if I might say so, Phil Lorne, with his work on the Genuine Progress Indicator. That's just as important for me. And we've got delusions of grandeur, I suppose, but who knows what actions are going to actually change the world. We want to change the world. And I'm not a Steve Keen. I'm not a great researcher. I'm not a bad teacher. So this is my contribution towards trying to change the world. If you like, I want to find another Steve Keen. That's what I want to do.
Beautiful stuff. All right, guys, I just want to tell the audience members watching this pre-record, stick around. We're going to be doing the live after show, so we can actually talk about what Stephen and Gabby said. They won't be around, so you could chat about anything you wanted about them in the chat if you want. Anyways, again,
nice.
Oh, go ahead, Gabby.
No, I'm saying please be nice. We're in. Are we on actually 3 different continents right now?
Well, we've got. Okay, let's bring Stephen, where are you right now?
I'm in Amsterdam.
Okay. Okay. Steve's in Amsterdam. Stephen, you're in somewhere in the outback.
Oh well, I don't know about that. I'm about 40 kilometers from Gabby. Yeah.
Okay. and Gabby, you're about 40 kilometers away from the outback yourself, then.
I'm in the heart of Adelaide, the beautiful city of Adelaide, South Australia, wine country, the festival state.
And
Wouldn't want to be anywhere.
I am in beautiful Vancouver, Canada. So we
I love
are on
Vancouver.
we are on 3 different continents, very unique places. So this has been great. Thanks, guys, and remember, stick around for the live stream right after this. Well, that was a pleasure to do the other night. Gabrielle Bond and Stephen Hale are very beautiful people. I was honored to have that conversation with them. Now, we're going to go into the after show now. We've got Steve Keane with us. We've got Mike Radzicki. We've got Daniel Sanderson as well. So we're going to chat about what we just saw. We're just going to chat about everything economics and, well, everything else under the sun. So stick with us. We're going to go into the after show. We did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it. So fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning. Boo-yah! That was great. I'm going to bring on the guys here in a second. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on Twitter, retweet and like, then come over here. Can I do the finger thing? Here we go. Lots of good chatting today. Really like it. I want to bring up kind of a company that's sponsoring our audiograms for us. They're called Recast Studio. I'm going to bring that up. These guys are a very small company, and they're providing a service for us, and we're very, very thankful. So throughout after each episode, I'd say around Tuesday, I create an audiogram, and basically I take the best audio I can find from the episode. I put it in a little graph, and I put it out on LinkedIn, Twitter, and it's really just a good way to kind of highlight the best parts of the show. Really, I think you want to check them out. For one, they have a free version. I think they put a watermark on your graphic, and then they have step ups, so you can pay and you get a few more features, right? It's really easy to convert podcasts, Zoom recordings, webinars, talking head videos, and other long form video content to really engage with your audience. Find if I can bring up the link. They are called recaststudio.com. And like I said, they've been providing the service to us for free. And that just makes our show that much better, being able to promote it. It's very important. Small company. When I first found them, I thought they were just some big corporation. Whatever. Use their service. And I actually talked to the owner and found out they were quite small. So very, very good stuff. I'll take this graphic down if I can find there we go. There's my pretty face again. I'm going to bring on Mike Radzicki first. Mike, how you doing, buddy? I can't hear you, Mike. What's going on?
There's a mute button. How about now? I'm doing well.
Oh, now I can hear you. Now I can hear you. How was your week?
Oh, it was fine. Nothing to report either way. Just another week of stuff, all good.
Another week of stuff. You're right up there with Dan when I ask him how his weeks were.
another week in paradise.
Speaking of Dan, I'll bring on Mr. Sanderson next.
Hey guys, how you doing? That was great. I really enjoyed that.
How you doing, Dan?
Good. Yes, very good.
How was your week?
Very busy, very busy. And I apologize mostly to Ty. I really should have been on that Wednesday night. I was out of commission and kind of sick. I think I went to bed early, and I apologize mostly to Ty. I should have been there.
That's okay. Like for us, that was midnight. So, but I think it was very important. There's actually a lot of great Australian economists and individuals in all the sciences, right? And because of our time, it's very difficult to get them on the show. So we tried to experiment with a recording, hybrid version of the show. You know what? I think the hour went well. All the chatters were engaging. So I think in the future, if we have an Australian guest, we're going to do this again. Yeah, I'm willing to stay up for these good people because I think it's very important stuff. I'm going to bring on the star of the show, Professor Steve Keen.
Hi, guys.
Steve.
Hi. Hey, Steve. This is the munchie. This is breakfast for you guys, isn't it? You and Daniel?
Yeah.
It's not quite brunch for Mike. We're getting in that direction.
It's a little after lunchtime for me.
Well, after lunchtime, is it? Okay.
Yeah, well, a little after 1 p.m.
Oh, okay. And it's 10 o'clock in the morning for you and Ty?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. All right.
Steve, how was your week?
Say 2 minutes. I actually can quote one of my favorite plays, which is called Fan Shen. And it's a play about why did the Chinese Communist Party manage to win in China. And Fan Shen the word means transform in Mandarin. And as part of that, the play explains that it was what happened at the village level that led for their success. And what they would do, and I didn't realize this until I saw the play, was they would lock all the villagers in the barn and ask them a question: who depends upon whom for a living? And the initial answers will all be, we've been dependent on the landlord because the landlord given us land, we couldn't grow the food. And then over several hours, after several hours of conversation, finally someone say, hang on a sec, we're the ones who work the fields. If we didn't work the fields, the landlord wouldn't get any food. And they finally realize the landlord depends upon them for a living. And they go and then overthrow the landlord, which is why they succeeded. But sometime later, the play then continues. And there's a peasant working out in the fields, the land's now owned cooperatively and so on. And a Communist Party official goes past saying, there will be a meeting. There is a meeting in the barn house tonight. And the peasant throws down his hoe and says, under the Kuomintang, too many taxes. Under the communists, too many meetings. So I had too many meetings last week. I've just finished another one. So I'm meetinged out. But you guys, it's fun to have a chat.
You know what? I really what I'm going to do from now on? Maybe I'm going to bring on Steve first and ask how his week went.
He's got great answers. We're like,
he's a natural lecturer, so he can bring out a story. And actually next week, Mike, I expect that from you because you are a natural teacher as well. So I have high expectations. So next week we'll work on that. Dan, you're just Dan. Yeah. I think we want to cover what we just watched for the last hour. I'll ask Dan first. What did you think?
I really liked it, but this is kind of like a prompt and a challenge to the teachers in the room, because MMT for me, I want to throw a word out called panacea, a fix-all sort of catch-all solution. Now, I only want to paint that picture for you guys, and primarily I'm throwing it out to the teachers, okay? And I'm saying, I realize that MMT is not the panacea, but I think it's very close to being a panacea. And I'm referring to the problems with climate. Now, there seems to me to be an incredibly horrible PR campaign that seems to be tanking and doing horribly well in the world when it comes to climate change. I find that the national interests and the conservative voices are getting stronger. And on one side, when we start to get into conversations about MMT, this is a very progressive, and I don't mean this from like a liberal standpoint. I mean progressive in terms of there's a lot of good in the world that an MMT solution could provide democracies around the world. And it doesn't seem to me that somebody in the world is really coming up with an all-inclusive sort of plan to really transform the world with this amazing new insight into monetary theory. Guys, Mike, Steve, like, help me out, because I never seem to have a satisfactory answer on this.
Steve?
Well, I'll start by saying that I've got to take my hat off, not that I'm wearing one, to MMT, because it's the first time since Keynes that a non-orthodox theory has become part of the popular discourse. So that's incredibly impressive. And people know that I've got some difficulties with parts of MMT, the export side, obviously. And I don't think MMT as a group yet, but it has yet integrated that thinking properly with ecology, which is why I'm so pleased with what Stephen and Gabby are doing in South Australia. But hats off to them, they've made it part of the discourse. Now that's remarkable. So Mike and I have been part of post-Keynesian economics. We haven't penetrated anything, but MMT got itself to the stage where the Republicans are passing motions in Congress trying to stop it, which shows how effective they've been. So on that front, fantastic. And I think if we are going to have any chance of addressing climate change, then part of that, it gets rid of the question, how we're going to pay for it. We'll pay for it using fiat money, okay? And there's no limit of fiat money. It's a question, do we have the physical resources and the time to make the transition that's necessary? To which the answer, I think, unfortunately, is no. But fundamentally, we can finance it. The answer is yes, and MMT tells us how that can be done.
Mike, what did you think about the entire recording? What's your opinions on MMT?
Well, I guess I'm an MMT person myself. That's what got me to meet Steve 20 plus years ago out at UMKC. And I've been trying to integrate it into system dynamics and into my coursework and what have you. I think, first of all, as our friend Randy Ray likes to say, a modern monetary theory is misnamed. It's neither modern nor theory. It's really mostly a mechanical description of how a fiat currency system operates. And so it's hard to quibble with, well, this is literally how the debits and credits work and what have you. It's pretty straightforward. We can model those with Minsky or a system dynamics tool rather than the traditional accountants' T accounts. But I mean, that's pretty straightforward. And it's not new. It's been around for forever, really. I mean, going back even to the Medicis in Florence, if you want to go, the start of double entry accounting. So then why isn't it well understood and widely taught and what have you? One of these peculiar questions. Well, first of all, it's quite counterintuitive, right? Abba Lerner, another famous economist that did teach at UMKC years ago as well, advocated what he called functional finance, which he thought was the logical extension of Keynes's general theory. And in fact, Keynes himself rejected it and said Lerner was wrong until he sort of thought about it and reread it. And then he came back and said, I think Abba Lerner is right. But Lerner contrasted that with sound finance, which is what we all think about in terms of our household budgets, our company budgets, our city budgets, our state or provincial governance budgets. If you're not a producer of your currency, then sound finance makes some sense, going from you, the individual, to the system wide, right? it's the same. But you get into the fallacy of composition, which is why we have macro. And Keynes told us this. His famous example was the paradox of thrift, right? If you save more, good for you. If I save more, good for me. If everybody saves more, ceteris paribus, you plunge the economy into a recession. If you balance your household budget, good for you. If I balance my budget, good for me. But if a sovereign nation with sovereign fiat currency does it, that can be a problem. If you run a surplus, even worse, right? Now you're in some sense harming the private sector. So this is counterintuitive. This is not how people think. This is not how politicians think. I don't care how much education you have. If you haven't studied this stuff, you don't think this way. And it's off-putting to somebody. What do you mean it doesn't matter if, we run a deficit or what have you? Now, these are not absolute statements, print money till the cows come home. No, inflation can be a problem, right? But it's just a very different way of thinking about things. And, it's just hard for people to understand. Their eyes start to glaze over. Now, the folks in Australia, God bless them. They have a lab. They're teaching students. And some of us need to be doing that. I've been doing it. Steve's been doing it, and more, you get the word out and people start to understand, and little by little, word of mouth and all that stuff. So I think in the fullness of time, this perspective will probably win. And it's needed to address the grand challenges of humanity, climate change and what have you. Because even if, very few people disagree, some do, that this or that is a problem, climate change or whatever, these grand challenges. The problem is, how do I pay for it? Infrastructure in the United States, everybody agrees, yeah, we should have good roads and airports and dams and bridges and stuff. It's how do I pay for it, right? So getting this understood, that it's not the same thing as your house or your business or your city government, or a nation. If sovereign nation with fiat currency, but you don't control it, like the euro, that's a different story. But under that financial regime, you can do a lot of stuff that will lead to economic good. And, it's just, you got to make a beginning. And I think the folks in Australia are doing that.
So for MMT, for me, and I'm going to have maybe some questions here for Steve on it. And so first and foremost, I learned MMT from Steve. I learned it from using Minsky. For me, I'm very much a visual learner, along with seeing the math behind it. So I instantly, laying it out in Minsky, I saw how the government creates reserves, that it's an act of government spending that creates reserves. I do have some struggles that MMT might not address the endogenous nature of the economy in the private sector. And I don't think that's an oversight of Kelton or any of the big names. That's one of my fundamental areas. And I'm going to bring in Steve because I can tell he wants to say something. Steve?
Well, I'll come back to your point. I wanted to make one point about Steve and Gabby, and that is that they're doing it in a private university. Now, this is a sign of how strongly normal universities, which are state-funded, have been captured by mainstream economists, because you couldn't get a curriculum like they've got together up at a normal university. They would reject it, okay? They want to have, we want to get people good publication records in mainstream journals. So that's why people like myself and Mike worked in, peripheral universities, Kingston and places like that. I think Worcester's probably better than Kingston, but, we end up in third-rate universities, and the Harvards and the Yales get the neoclassicals. So it shouldn't be the case, but it is the case that a government funding system, which is the sort of thing MMT is promoting in many ways, it means that's why neoclassicals are dominant, which is a real problem. On the MMT and the credit side of the economy versus the government-created money side of things, I think that's just a case of what people focus upon. So like I began in my work in the 80s working on modeling Minsky's financial instability hypothesis and then understanding private credit. And for some reason, I don't really know why, but that was my analytic focus way back, even before I became an academic. Back when I was a student at university, I I think I mentioned that one of my reasons for challenging Marxian theory was I couldn't swallow the argument that machines didn't produce value. And one of the things I pointed out at the time was the incredible growth of commercial real estate in Australia, the building of high rises and skyscrapers and so on during the building boom of 71 to 73. And I knew that was private debt finance. So for some reason, explaining private debt was always been an interest of mine. Now, the MMT people came from Warren Mosler's side, where Warren said, governments don't tax to spend, they spend to tax. And that was his orientation from working as a bond trader. And that's accurate. And now it's bringing those two together was really hard. So my first Minsky model I did back in 92, that included the government sector as well, but in a very stylized way. MMT built it from a double entry bookkeeping approach, and I only built the double entry bookkeeping side when I built Minsky. And even then, Minsky didn't start with double entry. By putting it together, I realized I had to implement double entry. So that was, it's just a long-winded explanation saying it's what you start from is different. Now, with Minsky, certainly, as you've seen yourself, Ty, you can integrate the two. Have a system where the credit money is created by the banks, fiat money by the government. You get all the logical links are necessarily covered in Minsky's, interlocking double entry bookkeeping framework. But now we've got a tool to bring them together. That's what we should do.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna leave the conversation because I want Dan and Mike the three of you to really hash this out. I'm going to leave it with one of my biggest issues, and I may be on the losing side here with all the chatters and maybe the three of you. I don't like, and I'm not an economist, but I don't like the consolidation of the central bank and the treasury, that idea of MMT. I find when I'm modeling it in Minsky, either this is something that's occurring in my own brain. I can't develop the separate dynamics that the central bank has away from the treasury. Am I wrong to think that way? Is MMT correct that they should just unify it, or
No.
should they be separate?
I think it's a logical, it's a short step. I mean, until you have something like Minsky, which can allow the double entry bookkeeping, what they're saying is we lump them together. And I think that was just because even though they got the double entry bookkeeping right, they were doing it verbally and using T tables and stuff like that. And it was just easy to do it that way. And they thought it was better to do that way because it was easy. Once you put Minsky there, as you and I have worked out, you must have the treasury and the central bank done separately. You can't, I'll give it a try one day, but very naturally, as soon as you had reserves at the level of the banking system, reserves and treasury, the treasury's general account at the level of the central bank, you then had the treasury above that, and you had to separate the two. It just didn't make sense not to.
Yeah, for me, and I've thought about trying to I just haven't got around to it, but naturally, reserves, that, go from banks or, not physically go from banks to the treasury account. That's an asset for the treasury, not a liability for the treasury. So to combine, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it, but I think it's what you say. It's actually beneficial to bring new MMTers in by simplifying it. So maybe it's both ways are right. Bringing in new people. Okay, let's make it easier. The central bank is part of the treasury. But I'm going to let Dan kind of frame these questions next for both Mike and Steve, and we'll suss this out a little bit more. Dan, what are you thinking?
I'm stuck, guys. I'm still stuck because, look, I have read Stephanie's book. And I find that I keep getting unsatisfactory answers. And I may sound stubborn, and I'm just hoping that you guys can kind of step me through the logic one step at a time, because, look, I understand that the government can spend more money with fiat currency. I understand that. Okay. Now, to me, the main limiting factor on just untethered spending from the government has to do with inflationary pressures and has to do with labor and resources. Now, are we in agreement with all of that?
Yeah, sure.
So I've got Mike agreeing, and I've got Steve agreeing to that. Okay.
Fundamentally, I mean, there are other limitations as well, but that's by far the most important one.
So let me talk in a little bit of a hyperbole here. Okay. So what if I were to say, the government could actually bring everybody in the country onto a payroll, and their payroll would be contingent on their climate carbon contributions, or what their carbon footprint is. Okay, so they have the money to pay every citizen in Canada, in America, in any country with a fiat currency. Okay, so what's wrong with that statement? To do something on such a grand scale.
There's no private sector to make the widgets, because you moved everything to the public sector.
So is that, and that's almost like a command-driven, state of what would we call it? Like when you go on like Social Security or something like that, right? So that's what is that what I'm describing?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, the sort of the subjective start of the story of modern monetary theory, because I suggested earlier, it's mainly a sort of a blueprint, a schematic of mechanically how things work. But the subjective part comes in at the beginning of the story, where the political system, whatever it is, it could be a dictator, it could be a pure democracy, it could be a republic, whatever, decides the size of the public sector. Do you want, more public schools or private schools? Do you want a bigger military or small? All that stuff. However that happens, here's the size of the public sector, and then the government has to move that amount of resources from the private sector to the public sector, and the taxation process begins that whole. That's the first domino to fall, and they use examples of colonial governments that came in, and that's how they did it, and whatever. So sort of by definition, the private sector makes the stuff, and then the public sector acquires it.
So this is an excellent use for modeling in say Minsky or system dynamics, because you have your stocks and your flows coming in, and you in theory you should be able to model when this is providing like tipping point pressures on the private sector. Is that fair?
Yeah. Sure.
Steve?
Unmute me? Okay. I actually go back to the work of Christine Desan. I think Christine's done some of the best work on how does a monetary system evolve, and how does it interact with the private sector. And so what she modeled, what she historically researched, was what happened in England after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So the Romans moved out something like about 200 AD, roughly speaking. And then you had a period where there was still Roman administration to some extent for another couple of hundred years. And then the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And then what you had was, for quite some time, people were using coins, Roman coins. Fundamentally, it's an accounting system. There was not a government to back it up. Now, you had in large way, England fell back to almost a subsistence economy for most of that time. Some trade, but fundamentally people would produce what they needed on the land they had. Feudal systems evolved and so on. Then she looked at a rise of a number of kingdoms, and I'm not quite certain where King Offa was. I think about 700 AD, but a particular king of a particular part of England, there were many kings at the time, developed a coinage system. And then what that meant was, if you had a feudal system, which was largely like subsistence agriculture of the feudal structure, then if you wanted to get resources for the king, you had to go and take your blade and put it at the throat of whichever noble you wanted things from, and give me X many chickens, blah, blah, blah. And then you walk away with the produce, and that maintained the military of the feudal lord. With the money, you'd walk up and say, we're levying taxes on you. We need money. You've got to pay us in our car. We're going to buy this stuff off you. So you've got the coins in circulation. You've got to pay us taxes in that thing. So you're taking the resources away from the private sector in that sense, as much as you were with the sword. But you also gave them a mean for commerce with themselves. So they could use the coins to then buy off the neighboring fief and so on. And what she argues is there was dramatic increase in economic activity out of the invention of fiat money. So fiat money enabled an actual economy, a market economy, to evolve. And this is the richness, I think, of the historical background to the MMT approach, that rather than the state oppressing the private sector, which is the way the neoclassicals and Austrians, I think another fight with a bloody Austrian before I got here, that's how they think about it. In fact, when you look at this historically, as Desan has shown, the evolution of the fiat currency enabled the market economy to take the place of a subsistence economy and have a dramatic increase in output. And Dan just asked for the reference, so I'll go and find it at my system and get back to you once I've got a quote from my bibliographic system.
So everybody, remember to like and subscribe to the channel. I've made some very controversial little side logos for the chat area. One with Larry Summers. I thought Steve Keen would like that a lot. And one with that central banker that runs the world, Jerome Powell. I got my pals wrong there. So I'll put those up every once in a while, but I'll also come on and tell you to, hey, hit that like button. That's important for the algorithm. Make sure you chat underneath the video too. Right now, this episode is one of our top episodes already. I'm looking at the numbers from both Twitter and YouTube. So this is great. This is really great stuff. I do have a question before Steve finds that book. I have a question for Steve, and it's from Ghost on the Half Shelf. Question for Steve: why does the Fed buying treasuries directly fix the problem like Silicon Valley Bank had? Steve, I'll unmute you.
Well, the fundamental thing is that then what you'd have is reserves would be backing the assets of the private banks, not treasuries. And reserves, they're identical in magnitude to money in that sense. So reserves wouldn't rise or fall in value if the interest rates fall or rise. So that's the main relevance. What's causing SVB's crisis, and it's a generic thing, that they're the canary in the coal mine, but the coal mine in general is having this effect. Rising interest rates are reducing the value of government bonds. So that's undermining the assets of the banking sector, and that's what's causing them to go bankrupt. But if the bonds were all owned by the central bank, that wouldn't be a problem. And in fact, you wouldn't need to pay interest on them either. You'd need to pay interest on reserves, because I think that to me covers the costs for the private banks of running the payment system. And there is no, Rex, please, I had this with an Austrian a moment ago. Fractional reserve banking does not exist. It is a textbook myth. Okay, there's no such thing. It's fractional reserve banking shows people don't understand how banking actually operates.
Yes, I agree. Listen to what Steve just said. Enough of that fractional reserve banking bullshit. Mike, tell me that question that I just brought up, kind of add to Steve's answer.
Well, I don't know. I agree wholeheartedly with what he said. So I'm not sure I have a lot to add. He kind of nailed that one right on hit it on the screws. Can I answer a question from the chat though that I think our audience might find interesting? Sorry to pivot on you, but so I think it's Joe asked about when did Keynes change his mind and agree with Lerner. And so the story is rather delightful. This is my recollection of it anyway, and that is when Lerner and Domar, FC Domar of the Herod-Domar model, were young economists in the early 1940s, I think it was. They went to hear Keynes speak at the U.S. Treasury, I think it was, and Keynes delivered his talk. And then there was a Q&A, and Lerner raised his hand and said, well, Mr. Keynes, did you read my recent article on functional finance? And Keynes said, yes, I did. And he really didn't like it. And he, in fact, embarrassed Lerner with his remarks. And obviously Lerner's feeling very bad, but Domar leaned over to him and said, Keynes should read the general theory. So then some years later, 3-4 years later, there's a very famous letter that Keynes wrote to Lerner, and it's titled At Sea. So Keynes was traveling probably to the U.S. again by boat, and it took some amount of time in that era to get across the Atlantic. And so he was doing correspondence, and he said, "I've read your recent book, and I find it wonderful or grand or whatever he said." And he said, "When I return, it's an important book. When I return to England, I'm going to bring it to the British Treasury and tell them about it, functional finance." But then he makes a joke at the end, and he says, "But I don't think they're going to believe it, so I'm going to tell it to the Treasury officials' children instead, because it's so counterintuitive." I think you can find the story in a book, and I don't know, I have it on my shelf to remember the title, but I think it was by Dave Colander, one of his books. He used to work with Lerner. So, and I think the story is recounted there, and they have the letter reprinted there and whatever. So at any rate, I just wanted to answer that one because I thought it's kind of a neat story. But yeah, Steve is right on in terms of the purchasing of the Treasury securities. And I think it cannot be understated the amount of people asleep at the switch with the current financial crisis, the banking crisis. The Federal Reserve was screaming from the hilltops that they were going to be raising interest rates and a lot. With inflation, you didn't even need to hear them saying that. You know they're going to do it. And there were people both on the regulation side and in-house at the banks whose job it is to check value at risk and just say on a daily basis, where are we at here? And with events that are occurring, whether with the central bank or in the world, where are we exposed? What possible problems are there? And these people were asleep at the switch. And, when the Fed is or the Treasury is going to bail you out anyway, you're not going to go to jail if you screw up or even lose your job. So I was asleep at the switch.
Yep. Steve.
Okay. I would actually like to know whether there are people in the Federal Reserve who are cheering us on here right now, because my expectation is that the people that are sitting around the FOMC boardroom are simply thinking in fractional reserve banking and lending out of reserves, all that garbage, and think interest rates control inflation and put them up without any recollection, without any acknowledgement that increasing interest rates is going to damage the assets of the banking sector. And then there may well be banking experts inside the Fed who are pulling their hair out saying, look, if you guys put up interest rates, you're going to bankrupt banks, and being pissed off that they're being ignored, not listened to by the people building dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models in the research section of the bank. I would love to know that. I haven't actually checked any of the recent minutes of the FOMC, but I doubt you'd find any reference in there about what this is going to do to the assets of the banking sector, and that's real damage. In terms of my own modelling, I normally, when I've modelled the banking sector as using Minsky and modelled Treasury, I simply have them having bonds and being paid interest on bonds, and I simply multiply the existing value of bonds by the current interest rate. But if you do it properly, you've got to have the value of the bonds being negatively related to the interest rate, and the bonds they have earning the face value of the coupon rate, not the current interest rate, which makes it a much more complicated system. Ty, you might have a crack at modeling that. But I think what that means is this Federal Reserve didn't realize that in putting up interest rates to control inflation, it was destroying the financial sector. And that shows one of the main dangers of having neoclassical economists in charge of anything other than the sheep dip. That's by the way the reference to Monty Python.
I can tell you.
Go ahead, Mike.
I can tell you a story that was recounted to me by Randy Ray, one of the founders.
Yeah.
And I think I'm allowed to say this, but I once asked him. I said, Randy, this makes so much sense. If somebody sits still long enough to work their way through your T accounts, or whether we model it in Minsky or whatever, it's just how the system mechanically works. You're laying out the wiring of the house. How does it work? I said, you got a Federal Reserve Bank here in Kansas City. Don't these people listen? Don't you do seminars there? And he goes, oh, of course. And he said, we had Richard Gephardt, who was, he ran for president of the United States. And I don't know how high he rose in the House of Representatives. He was pretty high up there. I think it was the House. He said, we had him here for half a day. he understood absolutely everything. That when we finished with him, he knocked it out of the park. He understood absolutely everything about modern monetary theory. So we said to him, are you going to go back to Congress now and start? He goes, are you out of your minds? He said, the headlines are going to read, Gephardt says deficit doesn't matter. He said, I'll be ruined. He says, I can't do that. And so the ridiculous story, the untrue story continues.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. So I got to take a quick moment. I know our three participants here probably find this irritating because I'm talking, and I'm not an economist, but I have to pay homage to all of our chatters from last week. So I'm going to do that right now. Let's bring up the list. We have Ghost on the Half Shelf. Again, you're number one. And by the way, my metrics is just how many times you type a message. Now, if I find a person that starts spamming, I'm not going to put you on the list. KK Bob, me and KK Bob or Kebab, we don't get along, but it is what it is. I think Steve's going to do something with him and Simon Michow tomorrow. So look out for that on Twitter. We've got Botch Mandela. We've just followed each other on Twitter. I've got some questions that I want to work with them. We've got Lana Dell. Thank you, Lana, for coming in. You make this show a lot brighter. We've got Thomas, Brown Warrior, Double K. Double K, I actually think paid Steve some money in order for me to take off some of my suit last week. But I can't do that. That's highly inappropriate. Real Progressives was in the house last week. That would be Stephen Grumbine and crew. He has a big crew behind him. Downtown Xmas Tree. Wow, that's a little bit early. But thank you for joining in. And Gary Parker, that looks like a new name. So glad to see there are some new faces in the chat. Daniel, what's on your mind?
Oh, it was starting to slip a little bit, but I just wasn't putting together what Steve and everybody was in agreement with about raising interest rates. And I think the idea was that as we raise interest rates, it's actually damaging to the banks. Now, in Canada, I have this idea that the banks are kind of like Vegas. They win every which way from Sunday. They're always going to win. They're always going to be ahead of the game. As interest rates move up, they're going to continue to earn money, and they made a ton of money while interest rates were falling, and they're going to continue to make money as interest rates rise. Now, that's just an assumption. That's just what I assume that banks in Canada are going to be able to do. Now, why fundamentally would I think that? Well, it costs more to go to a bank and borrow, and people still have to borrow money. So as interest rates go up, you still have people that are getting mortgages. You still have housing that needs to be purchased. You still have mortgages. You still have all of this stuff still continues on.
Yeah, but there's a problem, Dan. And this is the mistake that the Fed made itself. First of all, yes, you've still got people making loans, blah, blah, blah. There'll be less demand for loans with higher private interest rates, but there'll still be demand for loans. And you're still getting interest on your bonds. The trouble is the bonds are falling in value. Now, a bank must have assets greater than liabilities or it's bankrupt. So if you've got an increase in interest rates, the longer term your bonds have, the more there's an inverse relationship between the value of the bonds and the current interest rate paid on the same securities. And so when we've gone from where, 30 years, I don't know how many 30 years they issued at 0.5%, but there would be some 30-year bond that are getting 0.5%. Well, then you go to 4%. What are those 30-year bonds worth? About 1/8 of their original value. And therefore, if you've got enough of them, you're still making money on the bonds. You're still getting interest on the loans. But we're going to have, our assets are falling. 1/3 of our assets are falling by 70 or 80%. We're bankrupt. So that's the danger. It's the fragility of the system. And that's why I said it'd be better if the Reserve, given how much this is being mangled by neoclassical economists, It'd be better if the Fed bought bonds directly with the Treasury, and then it doesn't matter. You know, and or equally, the other way to go about it is all Treasury bonds should be floating rate rather than fixed, and then you wouldn't have a problem either.
Yeah,
What
okay,
we've got
that
at the
makes sense.
moment, catastrophically dangerous to reduce the value of bonds. But that, and I got blindsided by it because I haven't modelled. My bonds are just you know, in most of the simple models I've built, I just have bonds being an asset and they get paid the interest rate. But the real practical situation is they've got a fixed rate bonds, you get a coupon rate, and as you put up the interest rate, you reduce the value of the coupon compared to the interest rate you get on existing bonds, so the value plunges.
Okay, what do we have here? I have another question for Steve. Take at leisure, please. If Fed buys all the bonds, how do the banks have reserves? Don't they buy bonds and
No,
assets?
the wrong way around. When the government creates a deficit, and this is like, I didn't get this point myself. I hadn't thought about it until I read Stephanie's book, and then I thought I better model this in Minsky. Oh yes, she's right, and that is that when the deficit is run, the deficit increases deposit accounts of the banking sector, and it increases reserves by precisely as much. So the banks get reserves as a product of the government running a deficit. That's how they're created. The bonds are what the bonds then do. That's because there's laws which were I don't know when they were passed in America, but they were part of the UK system for a long time. Laws requiring the Treasury not to run a negative or an overdraft account at the Federal Reserve. Now, if it wasn't for that law, you could have the Treasury account being an overdraft and no bonds being necessary at all. But when you sell bonds, what you do is you get a cash flow from the reserves back to the Treasury general account. That means the general account, any deficit you run is covered by bond sales. And so the Treasury has a positive account at the central bank. So that's what bonds really do. They don't fund the government. What they do is they make sure the government's account at the Federal Reserve doesn't go into overdraft.
Interesting. Okay. Mike, did you have anything to add to that? Or I wanted to ask a question to Steve about his dream team.
Just a similar story that I learned that illustrates this is, let's say you have an economy in equilibrium, and I know that's, you know, we're sort of anti-equilibrium, right? But there's no pressure for change anywhere throughout in our little conceptual model. And then there's a shock to the system that knocks it out. Suddenly the US government needs an airplane from Boeing, let's say. So the Treasury in the old days would literally send a check to Boeing. Let's not worry about electronic transfers for the moment. So they send a check to Boeing. Boeing sends the plane to the government, the Air Force or something. Let's say the check's for $1 million. What does Boeing do with the check? They deposit it into their commercial bank, right? So now that bank's deposit side, its liability side, right, because it owes that money to Boeing, it's Boeing's money, goes up. But then they have it's balanced on the asset side of their T account, right? So now they can, how do they make money? They have to make loans, right? But we're in equilibrium. Nobody wants to make a loan, right? So what do? They offer it in the overnight market, right, to sister banks. Anybody short on reserves? We're in equilibrium. No. So what does it do? It drives the overnight rate to zero. But if the target from the Fed, because central banks set interest rates, is not zero, the Fed says no, no, no. And what do? They're going to sell bonds, right? And so that's a loan. A bond is a loan to the bank. So the bank has parked its money. It doesn't have idle money laying around. So think about it. The government deficit spent because we were in equilibrium, tax revenue matched spending, and now suddenly there's a shock. We're going to buy an airplane. So we're deficit spending. The pressure on interest rates was down, not up, like crowding out in the ISLM model, right? And the central bank was reactive. It had to do something because of that. So it sold bonds, right? But it didn't sell bonds to finance the deficit. It sold bonds to keep hit its interest rate target, right? And there's other T account sorts of things that Steve described too that would have needed to be adjusted as well. So it's simply reacting to what's happening. And notice how fiscal and monetary policy are intertwined in modern monetary theory. They are not independent entities that do their own thing.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Well, I know we've got 5 more minutes, and I wanted to bring up a question for Steve, and then I'm gonna pull it back to MMT, and this is just a slight example of funding that could come to Steve and his dream team. We've talked about this before, both on air and off air, but Steve's dream team would be an assembled, highly qualified group of people working with Steve under Minsky and a lot of different things, right? So Steve will explain what the dream team is, but from a modern monetary policy, if or from government spending, if they said, yeah, Steve, here you go, here's all the money you need, is there any like negative that you would see with that blank check being written?
No, I mean, this is the government. What if you look what we've had over the last 40 years, we've had the government dominated by neoliberalism, believing that, first of all, the private sector does everything better than the public sector, which ignores the question of long-term assets and what are the incentives for the private sector to maintain long-term assets versus the government. That's a huge issue. But we've also had them saying, well, the government should run a surplus. And what that meant is, they're wrong about the private sector. So you have degradation of long-term assets coming out of privatizing those assets. Secondly, you have not enough non-debt-based money being created. So what that does is people get encouraged if the government runs a surplus, it's actually reducing people's net financial assets. So what they'll do is try to buy non-financial assets, and what their prices rise, and you get asset bubbles. So there are no negatives to the government spending money on things like my dream team, which of course they won't do. It's the negative is not understanding how money is created, not understanding fundamentally the time dynamics and what the private sector is better at versus what the government is better at. And that's really the main danger. And I want to get us back onto that issue and saying, you know, what sort of things do you want to have a long-term perspective on versus what things are good with a short-term perspective? And that to me is a real dividing line between what the private sector is better at than the government and vice versa. And then what do you want to have as a monetary system? And I would fundamentally prefer one that didn't have so much private debt. And for that to be a possibility, you've got to have more government money creation. So that comes back saying the government should be spending money on things like my dream team, and also moon shots and getting to Mars and et cetera, and financing that innovative side of humanity where you wanted people to take risks where they're not necessarily profit on the other end.
Very nice. Well, we've reached the end of our 2-hour live stream, cut up into 2 shows. I'd like to thank everybody for joining in the chat. I'd like to really specially thank Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond for joining us the other day during their busy schedule. That was really great. If you're watching this now and you joined in late, that was in the first hour of the show. You can watch it on Steve's YouTube channel in its entirety. So thank you, everybody, for joining in. We will be back next week. We have a special guest, Dirk Entz, another MMTer. It should be another great conversation. He'll be here live. So until next week, see you later, guys. Bye.